The Haunting of Invisible Ghosts. His name was Henry, and he always enjoyed taking late-night walks. There was something about the stillness that made everything feel simpler. It had been this way for years, a nightly routine for him and his dog, Boss. Henry had been a welder for over 40 years. Now, he was living alone on this large farm. The house, too big for just one person, had felt empty ever since Maria, his wife, passed away. Henry's children had moved out long ago, and after cancer took his wife's life, it was just Henry, left alone with the memories. Tonight, after a long day, Henry decided to take a walk. The cool night air was refreshing, and his dog Boss trotted beside him, his nose sniffing the ground as if searching for something. As Henry made the loop around the house, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement in the second-story window. The bedroom window, the one that belonged to Maria. Henry stopped. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow, something or someone moving inside. Henry's heart raced, not believing his eyes. He hadn't set foot in that room for years, let alone let anyone else in. Henry stared up at the window, unsure if his mind was playing tricks on him, but something wasn't right. Without hesitation, he rushed inside, Boss close behind, and stormed up the stairs 2 at a time. When Henry reached the bedroom, the door creaked open slowly. The room was empty, exactly as he had left it. Henry's eyes scanned the space, nothing out of place, no signs of anyone being there. Henry felt foolish for overreacting, but that unease, that creeping sensation, stayed with him. Something had been there, Henry was sure of it. The next night, Boss's low growl woke Henry from a deep sleep. He sat up, listening, straining to hear over the pounding in his ears. That's when he heard the creaking of floorboards. Henry's first instinct was to grab his rifle, and he moved into the hallway, raising the gun. A dark figure stood at the end of the hall. A woman, her face obscured by shadows, her hand stretched toward him, fingers unnaturally long. Another night passed. Henry came downstairs early in the morning, only to find the kitchen lights on. He remembered turning them off. Henry grew tense and started calling the police. They searched the entire house, even bringing in the K-9 unit, but nothing turned up. Henry could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe him, but he knew something was wrong. That was the last straw. The next night, Henry went back upstairs. He didn't know what compelled him to return, but when he opened the door, the sight nearly stopped his heart. Maria's clothes, which Henry had packed away after she died, were scattered across the floor. It was as if someone had pulled them out. Panic rose in his throat. Henry staggered back, and that's when he saw her. A figure stood in the doorway. A woman, but it wasn't Maria. Henry couldn't make out her face, but she was shorter, thinner, someone he didn't recognize, and her presence filled him with dread. Before he could react, she ran, disappearing down the stairs and into the night. Henry chased her to the front yard, but she was gone by the time he made it outside. Bosley and Henry searched the property, but there was no trace of her. Henry didn't sleep that night. In fact, he hadn't slept in days. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind outside it all felt like her, lurking, waiting to return. Henry kept his rifle close, afraid he might actually have to use it. A few weeks later, it happened again. Henry was sitting in the living room, trying to distract himself with the television when he saw her. She was standing in the yard, staring at Henry through the window, just a shadow, silhouetted by the moonlight. Henry grabbed his rifle, his hands trembling, and ran outside, firing warning shots into the air. She turned and ran into the darkness, disappearing once again. The shots had probably scared her off for now, but deep down, he knew this wasn't over. The next day, after Henry had been out for errands and returned home late, he didn't see Boss greet him. He searched every corner of the house, but everything felt empty. But Henry still had one last room to check Maria's room. He stumbled into the bedroom, the door creaking open. Maria's clothes were no longer scattered across the floor. They were neatly hung. But what Henry dreaded had come to pass. The woman was still there, sitting on the bed, staring at him. Her eyes gleamed, and she smiled a cold, twisted smile. She whispered that she had been waiting for him. Henry froze, shocked. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. That voice, it was Maria's. But something was wrong. It was cold, hollow. Before Henry could react, her face shifted from an indistinct blur to something grotesque, her skin melting into a monstrous form. The skin peeled away, revealing rotting flesh underneath. Her eyes sank into her skull, her mouth gaping in a horrifying grimace. Henry screamed and raised his rifle, but it was too late. She lunged at him, and as darkness engulfed him, her fingers seemed to scratch and penetrate his chest. The haunting of invisible ghosts. Henry slowly woke up with a strange feeling, something rough rubbing against his face. It took a moment for Henry to open his eyes and realize it was Boss licking his face. Henry remembered the last time he couldn't find his dog, but after everything that happened, seeing Boss made him feel more at ease. Henry groaned, his whole body aching as he struggled to sit up. Everything felt too stiff, the joints rigid, and the muscles dull with pain, as if she had actually lunged at him, clawing and piercing into his flesh. Boss whimpered softly, his gaze fixed on the bedroom door. Henry glanced over and saw nothing unusual, but he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something strange was inside his own home. Days passed in a vague exhaustion. Every night, it was the same. Boss sat in front of the bedroom door, staring, ears pricked up as if waiting for something. Then, like clockwork, at that exact hour, he would start barking, the sound echoing throughout the house, jolting Henry from his restless sleep. He would get up, gun in hand, and search the house, but he never found anything. The house remained silent, the darkness unchanged. He tried to convince himself that it was just Boss being protective, or perhaps reacting to something normal outside. One night, the barking started again, more intense than ever. He jumped up, hurried down the stairs, gun at the ready, and froze at the sight before him. There, near the living room window, Mari was standing. Her face was gentle, hair flowing in the wind. Henry was paralyzed, an uncontrollable feeling swelling within him. Henry hadn't seen her in years. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of comfort. Boss fell silent, his barking turning into a faint whimper, as if something wasn't quite right ahead. He slowly approached the window, but then something changed. Henry stepped back as Mari's gentle form began to fade, her features distorting, as if cracking horribly, her joints twisting grotesquely, unnaturally. Her eyes seemed to darken, sinking into her face. Her mouth stretched into a wide grin, revealing sharp teeth, with black slime oozing through the cracks in her face. He suddenly realized she had come, perhaps deceiving him and appearing in the form of Mari's spirit. He knew that couldn't be his wife. The figure by the window vanished, dissolving into the darkness like smoke. Henry rushed outside, desperately searching for her, or it, whatever he had just seen. He circled the house, calling for Mari, as if somehow she might still be there, but there was no one. As Henry turned the corner of the barn, he suddenly felt an icy chill. The world around him seemed to shift. The night grew unnaturally dark. It felt like the darkness was swallowing the farm. He heard a whisper, soft and mocking.
Henry.
It was her voice, but distorted and broken, drawing him toward the barn. Henry pushed open the barn door, and there she was again, Mari standing motionless. The whispers grew louder around him.
Come home, Henry. It's time.
The voice echoed from every direction. The darkness closed in, pulling him to his knees as if hypnotized to obey. Her form began to twist again, skin peeling away, revealing a skeletal grin beneath. The barn door slammed shut behind Henry with a piercing noise, swallowing the faint light of the moon. The air filled with voices chanting Henry's name, full of malice. He stumbled back, desperate to escape, but the ground beneath him gave way, sending him plunging into a deep, cold pit. He landed hard on a damp surface. Henry reeled from the overwhelming stench of decay, and as he looked around, rotting corpses with sunken eyes stared back at him. He tried to climb out, but the walls of the pit were slick. The bodies began to move, their skeletal hands reaching out, grabbing Henry's legs, pulling him down. A grotesque figure emerged from the darkness above. It was her again, a monstrous version of Mari. Limbs elongated, her smile impossibly wide, filled with jagged, blackened teeth.
Henry, it's time to join us,
she said. Then suddenly, Henry found himself in Mari's old room. The figure leaned closer, its icy breath brushing against his skin.
You can't escape, Henry.
He felt an unnatural pressure tightening around his neck, and he couldn't move. As his vision darkened, it was slowly taking control of him. The first light of dawn crept over the farm. The house lay still and cold, its windows dark and empty. Boss lingered on the porch, his mournful howl echoing across the silent fields. No one knew what really happened. Henry was gone, or perhaps he was still there, but no longer himself. The mystery of the dolls. Her name is Mari. She was on her way to Manor Street, covered in thick fog. Siri's voice alerted, "You have arrived at your destination." The silhouette of the mansion slowly emerged from the fog. Perched on a hill, surrounded by strange 18th century architecture, it looked like something from a nightmare, making her uneasy. She parked her car a block away and walked the rest of the way. The Coopers were an old, wealthy family, and tonight, she was babysitting their 10-year-old daughter. Mrs. Cooper had explained over the phone that their regular babysitter had an emergency, and they were willing to pay her triple her usual rate. The offer was too generous to refuse. As soon as she stepped in, Mrs. Cooper, a pale and frail woman, greeted her on the porch with a forced smile. She told her, "Bridget is upstairs. I've left instructions on the table. Please, don't bother her too much." Mrs. Cooper kept glancing around, as if there was something she couldn't tell Mari. Mari walked down the dark, seemingly endless hallway. She followed the instructions left for her, leading to the room at the end of the corridor. When she entered, she saw Bridget sitting in the middle of the room. Her large black eyes seemed too old for her face. She was clutching a porcelain doll, its face eerily lifelike. She greeted Bridget, but Bridget remained silent, her eyes fixed on the doll. The room was filled with dolls, porcelain faces, shiny hair, all meticulously arranged around the room. Mari shuddered at how real their hair looked. She tried to engage Bridget with stories and games, but the girl remained eerily silent. Hours passed in strange silence until finally, around 10 p.m., Bridget said she was sleepy. Mari led Bridget to the bedroom, and that's when she noticed something was wrong. The girl began moving toward the dolls, saying, "They are my slaves." She could hardly believe her ears. She never expected something like that to come from a child. She knew she needed to keep a closer eye on the girl. By 2 a.m., she had dozed off on the couch. A sudden noise startled her awake. She groggily rubbed her eyes, trying to make sense of everything, when she realized someone was standing behind her. She thought it was Bridget. She couldn't believe her eyes. The girl's face was twisted, her features deformed, aging grotesquely. She clutched the doll tightly in her hands and muttered, I like your eyes. I will have them. Fear gripped her as Bridget lunged at her with an unnatural strength for a child. She fell to the floor, the weight of Bridget's small body pinning her down. She screamed in vain as Bree's hands scratched her face. I will take your eyes, Bridget hissed, her voice rasping as if it belonged to someone else. The girl began pulling at a handful of her hair wildly, gleefully. With all her strength, she shoved the child off. She ran down the long hallway, glancing back to see Bridget enraged, chasing her madly. In desperation, she grabbed a decorative figure from a side table and hurled it at Bridget. It struck her forehead, and Bridget screamed in pain, staggering back. But it wasn't enough to stop her. She ran until she burst through the front door, flagging down a passing car. The driver, alarmed by her disheveled appearance, helped her get to the nearest police station. When she returned to the mansion with the police, the truth revealed was more horrifying than anything she could have imagined. Bridget wasn't a little girl. The woman she had been babysitting was a dwarf, Mrs. C, Cooper's deformed sister, whose body never grew but whose mind had twisted into something monstrous over the years. She often comes to the mansion, kills them in their sleep, and collects what she likes. But what she likes the most is their hair. She will use it to make dolls. The police uncovered 7 bodies in the backyard, all young women, all missing their hair. The porcelain dolls in Bridget's room were adorned with their scalps, their hair meticulously attached to the dolls she called her slaves. Mrs. Cooper had been covering up her sister's crimes for years, burying the bodies and protecting her in some inexplicable way. The police arrested both women. She now sat in her small apartment, still haunted by the events of that night. She no longer babysat, and just the sight of a doll made her heart race. The memory of Bridget still haunted her dreams. Mysterious driver in the desert. Gavi was driving down an empty desert highway, stretching for miles, barren and silent. He had been driving for hours. The only sound was the crackling of his car's radio, which seemed to be breaking down, with only static and the occasional country tune. This was one of the rare times Gavi passed through here. He glanced at his dashboard map. No towns, no gas stations for miles, just an empty, desolate road. As Gavi approached a small hill on the road, he felt a sense of relief. The slight slope broke the endless flatness, providing a brief change. But as he went downhill, something caught his attention in the distance. At first, he couldn't tell what it was. Just a shape, a dark figure faintly illuminated by the moonlight. But as he got closer, the figure took form a person standing on the side of the road. Gavi slowed down, squinting to get a better look. It was a woman, standing alone in the middle of nowhere. She wore a long white dress and had pale skin. Her long black hair hung over her face as if soaked in water. Gavi muttered, wondering what she was doing out here. There was nothing for miles. No cars, no houses. How did she even get here? Gavi slowed the car further, considering whether to stop. Maybe she was lost. But as he got closer, something sent a chill down his spine. Her hair looked too wet, as if she had just walked out of a rainstorm, even though the desert had been dry for weeks. And her face, what little he could see of it, her eyes were too large, unblinking, staring straight at Gavi through the wet strands of hair. He hit the gas, speeding past her in fear. Even though he tried to convince himself she was just a lost traveler or perhaps a prank, Gavi couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Minutes passed, and Gavi continued driving through the endless desert, the eerie calm returning. He kept glancing in the rear-view mirror, feeling as if someone was watching him. He shook his head, trying to stay focused, but then Gavi saw another hill in the distance, just like the one he had passed earlier. And after a short drive, there she was again. The same woman, the same white dress, the same wet hair covering her face. But this time, she was closer to the road, and her smile was even wider, more unnatural. Gavi couldn't believe his eyes. How could she have gotten here before him? There was no way she could have moved that fast. He didn't think twice and slammed his foot on the gas, speeding forward to get past her. This time, Gavi didn't dare look back. Another hill appeared ahead, and the familiar fear tightened in Gavi's chest. He didn't want to go over it, didn't want to see her again, but he had no choice. His worst fear came true. She was there again, standing and waving at him. Her smile now impossibly wide, stretching nearly from ear to ear, and her cold, soulless eyes stared directly at Gavi. Maybe she was some sort of hallucination conjured by his imagination. No matter how much he tried, the fear continued to gnaw at him. He had heard the stories of haunted highways, of strange ghosts appearing to night travelers, but he had never believed them until now. He couldn't keep driving and needed to stop to escape this cursed road. But there was no exit, no rest stop. Gavi felt trapped with no way out. And then, the radio started crackling again. He reached out with a trembling hand to adjust the dial. But before he could turn it off, Gavi felt something cold touch the back of his neck. He froze. Reaching from behind the driver's seat was a pair of pale white hands. The fingers wrapped around his face, slowly digging their nails into his skin. Gavi was now about to face something he didn't understand, and he still had a secret he was hiding. Mysterious driver in the desert. Those fingers, they were slowly tightening around Gavi's face. They were icy cold. Cold like the touch of death itself. He was frozen in place. Slowly, with fear creeping down his spine, he turned to look. Gavi couldn't see the face those hands belonged to, but he had the sense it was a woman. Was it the woman? The one he'd passed many times on the highway? His mind was flooded with horror. The car swerved violently as the grip on him tightened. The tires screeched against the road. The car was losing control. The car veered off the highway, crashing into the rocky terrain with a sharp, grating sound. The impact was brutal, throwing him against the steering wheel as the airbag deployed. Pain surged through his body. Gavi's head hit the window, and for a moment, everything seemed to blur. Smoke rose from the crumpled hood, the headlights flickering dimly on the dark horizon. Gavi's vision swam as he tried to focus. He was still alive. Gavi could feel blood trickling down one side of his face. His limbs were heavy, weighed down. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. Then, he blacked out. In the distance, a car approached. The officer, a seasoned man who had seen his share of accidents, stepped out of his vehicle, his flashlight cutting through the desert's dark night. The car was a wreck. Twisted metal and shattered glass scattered across the rocky ground. Smoke still rose from the engine. The officer cautiously approached. The officer, Jay, shone his flashlight through the driver's side window. His eyes widened in shock when he saw the body still strapped into the seatbelt. After checking the license plate, he realized it was someone named Gavi. His head was twisted at a strange angle, almost wrenched to the side, and his eyes wouldn't close, wide open as if staring right at me. His face frozen in a horrifying grimace, blood smeared across his skin. But just as Jay started to step back, he heard something. A sound like someone crying, but it was muffled, as if something was blocking their mouth. The sound came from the trunk. At first, it was faint, barely audible. But as Jay leaned in to investigate, it grew louder, more desperate. It was a sobbing, painful cry, like that of a child trapped inside. Panic surged through the officer as he ran to the back of the car. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the trunk latch. Jay's mind raced with questions. Who could be inside? What had happened? 2 cases at once? The trunk lid sprang open. Jay's flashlight illuminated a haunting sight inside the cramped trunk, a little girl. A young girl, bound and gagged. Her wrists and ankles were tied tightly with thick, rough rope, and her mouth was sealed with tape. Tears streamed down her pale face, her eyes wide with fear. Not just that clutched tightly to her chest was a doll. The doll wore a white dress, its skin pale and cracked with age, its face fixed in a disturbingly wide smile. Large, dark eyes stared back, and its long black hair appeared wet, hanging loose. Jay reached out to touch the doll, and then its head moved. The girl sobbed, her body trembling as she clung to the doll. Jay staggered back, the weight of the doll's gaze pressing on him. He turned away, his breath becoming ragged, his heart pounding in his chest. The officer fought back his rising panic. It was just a coincidence, he told himself. He quickly untied the girl and removed the tape from her mouth. She gasped for air, sobbing loudly. Jay reassured the girl and led her to his patrol car. He called for backup. From the moment they got into the car, the doll sat there, staring at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him, studying him with its eerie and unsettling gaze. Soon after, backup and paramedics arrived. The girl was taken to the hospital, still clutching the doll, which baffled him. Her small hands clung to it as if it were the only thing tethering her. As the ambulance drove away, Jay remained haunted by the strange presence of the doll. He pondered the mysterious events leading up to the crash. Even though the girl had been rescued, the story felt far from over. It seemed to have slipped beyond Jay's understanding, perhaps into another world entirely. Nightmare House on the Hillside. I was 6 or 7 years old when my parents divorced. My younger sister had just been born. My mother and stepfather decided to move into a new house, thinking it would be a fresh start for all of us, but it didn't turn out that way. It was an old house in the suburbs, built in the mid-1800s. It had 2 stories and a basement below. Down there was a door that led to water tanks used to heat the house, locked tight, with only my mom and the landlord having the key. We were warned not to go near it. I didn't understand why, but my room was always colder than the other rooms, even though it was right above the basement. I often heard strange creaking sounds, like someone walking on the floorboards. The house was quite old, and I would often see wasps coming from the attic. They swarmed as if drawn to something. I wasn't the only one who experienced strange things. My mom and stepfather often heard footsteps in the living room late at night, pacing back and forth, never stopping. But they brushed it off and said it was nothing. One night, I woke up with a strange feeling, like someone was in the room with me. I turned over and saw a boy, his face obscured by shadows, wearing old-fashioned clothes, about my age, standing near my desk. I sat up in bed. He asked me if I wanted to play with his toys. I told him no, it was too late, and I didn't want to get in trouble with my parents. Then his expression changed, becoming angry. In the blink of an eye, he vanished from my cold room. I ran to tell my mom, but she reassured me it was just a dream. Still, I knew she didn't believe it either. I began to feel something was wrong with this house. The next night, it happened again. But this time, it was someone else, a woman in a black dress. She was standing on my bed. She stood hunched over, her tangled hair hanging down over my face. She stared at me with deep, hollow eyes that were completely black, her breath chilling as it hit my face. I jumped up, flung open the door, and ran to my sister's room. She was still asleep in her crib. I looked back at the door and saw the woman slowly walking toward me. As she passed the window, lightning struck outside, and in that moment, the woman disappeared. With each flash of lightning, she would reappear, getting closer to me. I woke up again, back in my bed, drenched in sweat. My heart raced as I tried to piece together what had happened. Was it a dream? But it felt too real. I ran to my mom and stepfather, telling them everything. Their faces went pale as I spoke, but they told me it was just a nightmare. It was a lie they had been telling me ever since we moved into that house. A few days later, we moved out. My mother didn't say why, but I could tell by the way she hurried us out of the house that something had scared her too. It wasn't until many years later that she told me. The landlord eventually confessed what had happened in the house long ago. During the Civil War, a widowed mother and her 3 children lived there. After her husband was killed in battle, the woman's mind shattered. You ever or roller? In a fit of madness, she killed the rest of her family in the living room before dragging their bodies down to the water tank room in the basement. These things explained what I had experienced in that house, from the moved items to my toys being displaced. The boy I saw was one of her children, still trapped in the house, either searching for companionship or perhaps seeking revenge. And the woman, the one who stood over my bed, was the mother, her spirit twisted by the horrors she had endured. I often wonder what would have happened if we had stayed in that house. Would we have become part of their story? Would that woman have done to us what she had done to her own children? I will never know. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still think about that house on the hill and the dark secrets it held. We met a crazy clown in the woods. In the summer of 2016, amid bizarre clown sightings across the USA, I stayed at our friend Milo's house, which bordered a dense forest. After a day of movies and snacks, we felt restless and decided to take a late-night walk. Armed with flashlights, we ventured into the forest at 2 a.m., our conversation mingling with the sounds of the night. By 2:45 a.m., we reached a clearing with an old, creaky playground, until Milo pointed towards the old restroom building. There, partially illuminated by our flashlights, stood a man in a tattered blood red clown suit. Unlike the playful clowns from childhood, this one was menacing. His face was pale, with smudged makeup and a wide, eerie grin. His hair was a tangled mess of red and black. Paralyzed with fear, we watched as the clown stared at us, his head tilted to one side. Then, he started walking towards us, slow but deliberate. Panic surged through us, and we instinctively backed away, trying to decide whether to flee or confront the figure. Suddenly, the clown broke into a sprint.
Help me!
That was all the motivation we needed. We turned and ran as fast as we could back towards Milo's house, the forest path a blur beneath our feet. After what felt like an eternity, we burst out of the forest and onto the road in front of Milo's house. We glanced back and saw the clown standing at the forest's edge, partially illuminated by the streetlight. He had stopped running but was still watching us, his sinister grin visible even from a distance. In his hand, he held a big rusty axe. We didn't wait to see what he would do next. We bolted into Milo's house, slamming the door shut behind us. Milo's parents were out of town, so it was just the two of us, alone and terrified. We gathered in the living room, each of us trying to catch our breath and process what had just happened. Milo turned on the front door camera, and we watched the screen in tense silence. The clown appeared at the edge of the frame, walking slowly down the street towards the house. He stopped in front of the gate, looking around as if searching for something. My heart sank as he approached the front door, his gaze fixed on the camera. He leaned in close, his face filling the screen, and made a series of grotesque, mocking gestures. He waved the knife slowly before stepping back and disappearing down the street. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, too scared to sleep. The image of the clown's twisted grin and the knife haunted our thoughts. We didn't tell anyone about the encounter, fearing disbelief or ridicule. To this day, the memory of that night lingers, a chilling reminder of how a seemingly innocent adventure can turn into a nightmare. We often wonder what might have happened if we hadn't run back to Milo's house, and the unsettling question of who, or what, the clown continues to haunt us. Night shift at the morgue. I worked as a security guard at a local hospital in the morgue area. The place often experienced break-ins by a few addicts trying to experiment with some strange chemicals stored in the lab, and eventually it became their final resting place. Everything started like a normal night shift. Hygiene plays a crucial role in the hospital. To keep the place more sanitary, they recently installed automatic sliding doors that open when someone passes by, eliminating the need to touch any door handles. Every night at exactly 3:00 a.m., the door would open for a few seconds and then close again. I believe the door was programmed with some kind of time-based trigger, but when I contacted the door installation company, they told me that was impossible since the door was designed to open only when the sensor was activated or manually operated. So, this continued without explanation for a long time and became a routine for everyone watching the door open and close on the monitor every night. Tonight, I was on shift alone because my colleague was sick, and there wasn't enough time to find a temporary replacement on such short notice. I was no stranger to danger and didn't worry about working alone at night. The security monitors showed only 2 cameras, one facing the control room and another at the far end of the hallway looking toward the morgue entrance. When the clock struck 3:00 a.m., I did what every night guard on duty would do. I started watching the screen. As usual, the door moved, but honestly, I still got chills sometimes from the sudden rush of cold air every time the door opened. Suddenly, the door remained open. I thought it was a screen glitch, but the lights on the door were still flashing. I waited a few minutes, but I soon realized I had to go down the hallway because the morgue door was strictly prohibited from being left open. As I walked down the hallway, the cold air blew against me, and I thought it would be even colder when I reached the morgue. I had hoped that the door might have closed by the time I got there, but just as I saw on the monitor, the door was indeed still open, and the camera was functioning normally. I tried waving my hand in front of the sensor, but it was useless. The door didn't budge. I reluctantly considered my next option, which was to check the sensors from the inside. As I turned around to look down the hallway, the door finally closed. I felt my hair stand on end as a strange quietness settled in a sensation like someone was standing right behind me. Out of curiosity, I went back to the monitor. I decided to rewind the security footage to the moment I approached the door to see if I could spot anything unusual. And what I saw was something I shouldn't have witnessed. There was a girl standing in front of the door behind me. I couldn't clearly see her face because of her long black hair and the white dress she was wearing. She just stood there smiling, staring at me with one eye. To this day, I still can't explain it, as I had just been there and hadn't seen anyone. It wasn't until I checked the other camera that faced the entrance to the control room that I truly shuddered, and I still have nightmares about it to this day. Due to a mysterious power surge, most of the data on the drive was completely corrupted. I stared at the blank screen, my mind reeling. The events of that night played over and over in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still in the room, watching from the shadows. Every night, as I try to sleep, when the clock strikes 3:00 a.m., I can still feel the chill in the air, the weight of invisible eyes on my back, and the quiet whisper of the girl who is there. The freak in the morgue. The coldest place in the hospital is likely the morgue. Stainless steel drawers holding the dead stretch out like a cold, metallic labyrinth. The air is thick with the scent of antiseptic. I am a forensic pathologist. Today, I'm on shift, preparing my tools for my work. Tonight, I noticed something strange. Foreign objects have appeared during autopsies before, like a rusted coin or a few plastic beads. This isn't the first time something unusual has shown up during an examination. I stepped into the storage room, searching for some necessary items, but a few tools were missing. My eyes were drawn to a drawer slightly ajar. I pulled it open to find an empty space, feeling like something was missing, but I couldn't immediately identify what. A strange feeling washed over me, and I couldn't quite grasp what was happening. I hurried out, moving quickly down the dark hallway. I saw something move in the shadows. A hunched figure, resembling a man, dressed wildly with disheveled hair, was obsessively examining some medical equipment laid out before him. I couldn't believe my eyes. Horrified, I saw a clump of hair, a severed finger, and other small body parts. He held them as if worshiping and collecting them. I felt nauseous and disgusted by him, but I forced myself to stay because I knew I needed to do something. I hadn't finished my work yet. Suddenly, the man stopped and looked around, sensing something. I held my breath, praying I hadn't been seen. I rushed to the office, my hands trembling as I called the police, reporting the break-in and what I had witnessed. The dispatcher on the other end sounded shocked, but assured me that help was on the way. I hung up the phone, but I couldn't get that horrifying image out of my mind. Who was he? And what was he doing? Suddenly, while trying to find a place to hide, he spotted me and chased after me, as if he wanted to make me his next victim, the next piece in his collection. I ran as fast as I could, desperately searching for a place to hide. Fortunately, the police arrived just in time, and perhaps he realized that it was no longer just the two of us. He became distracted, giving me a chance to escape. I managed to escape and crouched behind the desk, eyes fixed on the door, counting every second until the police arrived. The police burst in and found the intruder in a frenzy, as if he had lost his mind. He was caught off guard, his crazed eyes wide with panic. The officers quickly subdued him, wrestling him to the ground as he snarled and fought like a cornered animal. They handcuffed the man and began searching the area where he had been, uncovering his gruesome collection of stolen medical tools, body parts, and a disturbing array of personal items taken from the corpses. His twisted obsession and grotesque passion were fully revealed. I stepped out of the room, still trembling, as the police led the intruder away in handcuffs. The man glared at me with pure hatred. The morgue, once a place of routine and order, had become a site of horror, tainted by human depravity. As the first light of dawn broke, I stepped outside, knowing I had done the right thing and acted quickly. The dead had already suffered enough, and it would have been a tragedy if they were not kept intact. I turned back to the morgue, locking the door one last time. The memory of that night would haunt me, but it was over. I had survived the worst. Stranger on the way home. I was driving home on a quiet, deserted road, my headlights cutting through the thick darkness. A familiar road I had traveled countless times. I was still about 10 minutes away from home when my car began to slow down. Confused, I pressed the gas pedal, but the car continued to lose speed. Panic set in as I realized the problem I had run out of gas. I suddenly remembered the low fuel warning light had come on, but I had forgotten about it, and in my rush, I had completely missed stopping to refuel. My car stalled, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I stepped out of the car, the chilly night air biting at my skin. Glancing at my phone, I saw the worst: no signal. I wasn't surprised. This road had no reception. I stood there for a moment, weighing my options. It was nearly midnight, and there was no point in calling anyone. My friends were likely already asleep. I knew the area well enough to remember a gas station about a mile away. It would take 20 minutes to walk, maybe less, and the weather was fairly mild. So I decided I would make the quick trip. I grabbed an empty gas can I kept in the back of my car for my lawnmower. At least luck was on my side in some small way. There were no streetlights, only dense forests on either side. The road was eerily quiet. Only one or two cars passed by, their headlights briefly illuminating the empty road before vanishing into the night. As I walked, my footsteps crunched on the gravel by the roadside. Every sound seemed amplified by the stillness. I felt a bit uneasy, but I kept walking. Then, I heard it. It was the sound of a car engine behind me. I stopped and turned around. A pickup truck was slowly approaching the spot where my car had broken down. My first thought was that they might stop to help, and for a brief moment, I considered asking for a ride. But then I saw them, two men. They got out of the truck, their faces quickly obscured by black masks pulled over their heads. One of them shined a phone flashlight into the window, while the other knocked on the door. They tried to open it, but of course, the doors were locked. I crouched down and moved closer to the edge of the forest, hiding in the shadows. Maybe they hadn't seen me yet, but they were rummaging through my car. Panic rose in me when one of them turned and looked in my direction. Suddenly, he started walking toward me. I froze. The other man got back in the truck, and I heard the engine roar as it sped forward, heading straight for me. I didn't have time to think. I sprinted into the forest. Behind me, I could hear the man crashing through the undergrowth, chasing me. I couldn't stop. I couldn't let them catch me. In what felt like an eternity, I ran through the edge of the forest, dodging trees and leaping over fallen logs. After a few minutes, I saw a large, isolated house ahead of me. I ran behind the house, pressing myself against the rough, cold brick wall. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my ears straining to hear any sound of pursuit. I crouched there for a few minutes. Finally, I dared to move, cautiously slipping through the backyard toward the old path. I didn't want to knock on the door because it was too late, and I didn't want to cause them any alarm. I walked on high alert, every sound making me shiver. I looked around the area. No truck, no sign of the men. I continued walking toward the gas station. Another car came, and without thinking, I rushed back into the forest, hiding until the sound of the engine faded away. Finally, the gas station appeared in front of me. I felt relief as I filled up the gas canister. When I finally made it back to my car, I shakily poured the gas into the tank. I drove straight home, too scared to look back. As I sat in the safety of my own home, I couldn't shake the thought of those men, and I realized how lucky I was to have made it home safely. Blue flames. I live in a suburb where there aren't many opportunities for hiking or camping. I will go camping for the first time in a remote forest. I think it will be a perfect camping trip because the land is flat. At the end of the trail, there will be a small pond. I walked for about an hour, but was a bit disappointed as it was quite small and surrounded by mud. However, it was enough for me to experience lying on a boat in the midst of nature. Suddenly, a thick mist crept through the bushes, clinging to the ground like a living entity that looked like a zombie rising from a grave. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. The sound of birds chirping echoed back, strangely distorted, indescribable. After setting up the tent in a drier spot, I asked him to take a walk around the lake because I saw quite a lot of interesting things around here. I wandered over to the other side of the pond, and there wasn't really much there, so I tried to go deeper. I suddenly discovered a mound of earth that looked like something had been buried recently, and it gradually emitted a very unpleasant smell. I turned my back. The fog was thick, covering the ghostly road, cold, suffocating silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. I started to head back to my camp, and by then the sun was almost setting. I had a small lighter with me, so I used it to light a campfire and heat some food. I sat eating and chatting about everything with Tin. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise. I was confused, wondering if there was anyone else out here besides us. Maybe I had disturbed them? As the sun set, I noticed a light hovering across the pond. It was within the trees just outside the pond, but I had walked there an hour earlier and knew there was nothing there. Tin jokingly said it might be a will-o'-the-wisp and that I should be careful or it would take me away. We joked around and then acted like nothing happened. At night, occasionally, I glanced over at the pond a bit. I wasn't sure what to do, but an hour later into the night, I saw from the corner of my eye that the light began to fade, and suddenly, a blue light flickered in the air and then disappeared. I didn't dare call Tin because he would punch me. I stared into the dark forest, feeling empty again. For about 10 minutes, I waited for the light to turn back on, but it didn't appear. That gave me chills, but I figured I must have been seeing things or dreaming. The dense forest was shrouded in darkness when my friend and I were suddenly awakened by a howling sound. Lights started flickering in front of the camp. I thought they were fireflies, so I asked Tin to go see because you rarely see this in the city. Tin and I decided to go on an adventure together. I must say we were really brave despite being a bit scared. Going deeper, the path opened up to a small clearing, surrounded by spindly trees with arrows on them. We immediately followed. Suddenly it was a mound. The ground around it was bare, as if nothing dared to grow near it. I approached and saw an ancient stone ring full of moss half buried in the ground. The air is thick with unspeakable fear, as if the stones themselves hold the memory of horrors. The tiny lights began to gather, swirling around each other to form a magical circle. This light illuminated the ground, creating strange patterns. My curiosity began to rise as I moved closer to take a closer look. I couldn't see clearly, but somewhere from under the mound of earth, something that looked like a horribly rotten hand like in those zombie movies emerged from the ground. Then the blue flames began to fly out rapidly like evil fireflies wanting to eat us, causing us to panic and not be able to run in time until we fell covered in mud. We started to panic. I screamed and waved a stick around instinctively, but Tin, being braver, took out his phone to take pictures. Moments later, we mysteriously lost consciousness and woke up near our tent. When I looked around, the blue light had vanished, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling and the distant hooting of an owl. He took out his phone to check. The photos no longer seemed like a spiritual phenomenon. Just as dawn was breaking, we were too terrified and quickly left the forest, praying as we hurried away and vowing never to return. When I got back, I researched and found out that the forest was cursed with an ancient spell, which is why few people visit. We had gone without knowing. It was fortunate that we were still alive. Train through time. At a train station, as some people hurriedly catch the last train home. Among them is Leah. As the train departs the station, Leah sits down in her seat, looking out at the city skyline fading into the distance. She feels a strange sense of unease, though she cannot understand why. The rhythm of the train is steady, almost hypnotic, lulling her into a gentle sleep. The soft rumble of the train fills the air as it speeds along the tracks, the city gradually giving way to darkness. Leah is startled awake as the train sways slightly upon entering a long tunnel. Inside, the tunnel is pitch black, and the train's lights flicker momentarily. Leah looks around, noticing that the once crowded train car is now eerily empty. She glances out the window, but instead of seeing the countryside she expected, there is only a vast, empty void, as if the train is traveling through an immense, empty space. As the train exits the tunnel, Leah is shocked to see an entirely different scene outside. The modern city and familiar countryside have vanished, replaced by a mist-covered, ancient village. The buildings are old and crumbling, with thatched roofs and cobblestone streets. The train slows down as it approaches a station that appears to have never been used. The train stops, and the sliding door opens with a faint hiss. Leah hesitates, but the strangeness inside the train compels her to step outside. As she steps onto the platform, the cold, damp air hits her, filled with the smell of earth and decay. The village is deserted, with no signs of life. The only sound is the cawing of crows. The village looks like a snapshot from the past. Tables are set with dust-covered plates, untouched. A child's toy lies abandoned on the street. She realizes that she is no longer in her own time. Perhaps she has traveled back to a long-forgotten era. Suddenly, Leah hears a sound like a train whistle, and panic overwhelms her. She runs back to the platform as the village around her begins to change. The sky darkens at an unusually rapid pace. As soon as she reached the platform, the train began to accelerate, the doors still open. With a desperate leap, Leah grabbed onto the railing and pulled herself inside, collapsing onto the floor of the train car, where she lay, gasping for breath. As the train sped away from the village, Leah slowly stood up and looked out the window. The village was quickly swallowed by the darkness. The train entered another tunnel. She braced herself for whatever might come next. When the train emerged from the tunnel, Leah was stunned to see a different scene. This time, the train was traveling through a futuristic city filled with towering skyscrapers and strange objects floating in the sky like giant bubbles. The train glided smoothly through the city, and she realized with growing horror that the train was not taking her home, it was carrying her through different eras. She was trapped in a time loop. Finally, the train began to slow down again, this time approaching a station that looked familiar. But something was wrong, everything was slightly off, like a distorted reflection. Leah hesitated, unsure if she had truly returned to her own time. The station was eerily quiet. She stepped off the train, heart pounding, and looked around to see the station just as she remembered it. As the train pulled away, Leah watched it disappear into the tunnel, leaving her standing alone on the platform. She started to walk towards the exit, but stopped when she noticed something on the ground. She picked it up and was startled to see that it was an old, intricately decorated pocket watch. with strange symbols engraved on its surface. The hands of the watch were spinning rapidly, as if caught in a never-ending cycle. The train may have brought her back, but perhaps she was still trapped in this loop. Maybe it would soon return to take her on another journey. The haunting of the abandoned station. It was a chilly autumn evening in our small town. Inside the diner, warmth enveloped me. Sarah, my girlfriend, was finishing her cup of coffee. We had been dating for a few months, and tonight seemed like the perfect opportunity for an adventure since we both enjoyed that. After dinner, we decided to explore the old abandoned train station in town. The train station loomed before us. Built in the early 1900s, it had once been the heart of our town, but now it lay in ruins, overtaken by nature. My heart raced, but I didn't want to show fear in front of Sarah. I reassured her, even though I felt a hint of doubt creeping in. She began glancing around nervously and told me she felt something was off. Then, from afar, we heard a faint whistle echoing through the air. Sarah asked me, "There are no trains running here anymore, right?" I only knew that no trains had run here for decades. The whistle grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of wheels clattering on metal tracks. Sarah tightened her grip on my arm. "We need to go right now," she urged, panic rising in her voice. But somehow I lost control, as if mesmerized by the sound, stepping closer to the edge of the platform, staring down the empty tracks. The sound grew louder, yet no train was in sight, just the tracks stretching infinitely into the darkness. Then, as if summoned from nowhere, a blinding beam of light appeared, racing toward us. It approached quickly, gliding down the tracks like a ghost, but something was off. That light wasn't attached to any train. It hovered. Sarah screamed, urging me to stop, pulling me back just as the invisible train roared past. Its force nearly knocked us over, the platform shaking violently. For a moment, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, the station was silent again, the air heavy and still. Distant sounds returned, but something had changed. Sarah was gone. "Sarah," I called, panic rising within me. I searched for her frantically. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing on the tracks, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, its eyes glowing red like embers in the dark. A chill ran down my spine as it raised its hand, pointing down the tracks. Far down the tracks, I saw Sarah, walking away from me. But she wasn't walking normally. Her movements were stiff, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. "Sarah, stop," I yelled. But my voice echoed back, swallowed by the night. I ran toward her, desperation driving each of my steps. The closer I got, the more horrific reality became. Her face was blank, expressionless, her eyes vacant and soulless. It was as if her very soul had been drained. Tears streamed down my face as I reached for her, but the distance between us never closed. The shadowy figure at the station let out a raspy laugh, echoing through the trees, sending waves of fear crashing over me. I turned to face the figure, but it had vanished. In its place stood an old, rusted, decaying train, its windows shattered. Shadowy figures filled the cars, their hollow eyes staring at me. The door creaked open, like an invitation into the darkness. My heart raced with fear and curiosity. A whisper brushed my ear. "Join us. We've always been here waiting for you." I shook my head, backing away, but the pull of the train was too strong. My legs moved on their own, drawing me toward the door. Just as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. The train swayed, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I turned to see Sarah sitting across from me, her eyes vacant. "What's happening?" I choked out, but she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly raised her hand and pointed out the window. I looked outside. I was standing on the platform, staring at the train. But how could this be? I was inside. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The train raced faster and faster, the outside world fading into a blur in whispers. Suddenly, it stopped, and the door creaked open. Then, that dark figure appeared inside the train, leaning in close, its cold breath chilling me to the bone. "You should never have come here," it whispered, and everything went dark. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold ground, the train and station gone. All that remained was an empty field overgrown with weeds, a stark contrast to the horror I had just endured. I stood up, dazed and disoriented, and headed back to town. As I neared the town square, something caught my eye, a missing person poster. It was Sarah's face, but the date was from 10 years ago. My heart sank as I stumbled back, trying to comprehend the horror. Had I really been gone for 10 years? Or had Sarah vanished long before I ever met her? The truth was too horrific to grasp. Desperate for answers, I rushed back to the station, but when I arrived, it was gone. Only an empty field remained. The train, the darkness, the station all vanished as if they had never existed. Memories flooded back the faces of victims, broken families, the whispers of those who had vanished without a trace. Each shadow symbolized a haunting reminder of what I had escaped, of the guilt I carried for failing to protect those who needed me most. I turned away and walked on, ready to embrace the memories instead of fleeing from them. The shadows may linger, but I would no longer let them control my life. The Clown in the Tree. This happened to me when I was 14. It was the same year everyone was talking about creepy clowns lurking in random places. The stories were everywhere, but I never took them seriously until I had an encounter of my own. I was sitting alone in the living room. My parents had gone to my grandparents' house for the evening, leaving me home by myself. But instead of feeling free, there was a strange unease I couldn't shake. I texted some friends, inviting them over to kill time John and Emma. We played video games for a while, but after a few hours, we got bored. John had an idea. He said, "Let's go into the woods." There was a forest right behind my house that we usually avoided, especially at night. But it was still light out, and with nothing else to do, I agreed. We gathered ourselves and headed out. Part of me regretted it as soon as we left the house. The forest was dense, tall trees casting cool shade, but we weren't scared. We joked around, tossed sticks, and laughed about nothing. We had been there for about 20 or 30 minutes when we heard something strange. Someone was crying. The sound was faint but unmistakable, like sobbing, desperate, coming from deep within the trees. We all stopped, staring at each other. John was the first to break the silence, whispering tensely, "What the hell is that?" None of us knew, and Emma suggested we go check it out. I wanted to say no, but before I could, everyone was already heading towards the sound. My heart started pounding harder with each step. Something felt wrong, like we were walking into a place we shouldn't. As we got closer, we saw a figure slumped on a large branch of an old tree. It was a man, dressed as a clown. His outfit was white with black polka dots, but it was stained and torn. He wore a black wig, but it was messy, and his makeup was smeared by what looked like tears. He just sat there, quietly crying. John, being the idiot he was, yelled, "Hey, you idiot! Why are you crying up there?" A chill ran down my spine, and I instantly turned to John, telling him to shut up. But it was too late. The clown looked down at us, his tear-streaked face twisting into a smile. His lips curled upward, but it was hollow, as if he was trying to express something through invisible pain. And then I saw it. His hand. gripping a large machete, the blade covered in what looked like blood. We were frozen. He just sat there, staring at us, his smile widening grotesquely, yet his eyes were cold, emotionless. He said, "You won't understand, but when I show you, you will." Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I screamed, "Run!" We scattered, running in all directions. My heart pounded, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted towards home. The forest seemed endless, branches scratching at my skin as I ran. I could hear the others screaming, their voices fading as we were separated. I reached the edge of the woods, sprinting into my backyard. I didn't stop until I was inside, slamming the door behind me. Then, I waited for my friends. Emma made it back, panting and pale with fear. But John wasn't with us. We waited for him, hoping he'd burst through the door, laughing about how scared we were. But then we waited, and no one came. We called the police. They came and searched the forest. We told them everything: the clown, the machete, the crying. They didn't seem surprised. It turned out the man we saw was a local. He had been on the run for days. The police said he was a heavy drug user who had killed his wife and left her body wrapped in a white sheet. The next day, they found John. He was dead, discovered in a deep lake in the forest. The man must have chased him while the rest of us ran. I couldn't believe it. John was gone, just like that. And it was my fault for agreeing to go into that forest. If I hadn't, maybe he would still be alive. I told my parents everything, and they promised never to leave me home alone again. But it didn't help much. I couldn't sleep for weeks, and when I did, I had nightmares of the clown standing in the forest, smiling at me with his blood-stained machete. It's been 5 years since that night. I'm 19 now, but the memory of what happened in the forest is still burned into my mind. John's disappearance and the discovery of his body in the lake. It haunts me. No one ever talked about it after the police closed the case. A tragic accident, they said. A drug-crazed maniac. But I knew there was more to it. For years, I pushed the memories down, but recently, they've started to resurface. It began with nightmares, the image of the clown, his twisted smile. But lately, it's been more real, as if he's not just in my dreams anymore. Something is coming for me. I've started feeling like I'm being watched again, just like back then. And tonight, I swear I saw him, standing at the edge of the forest behind my house, staring at me. I grabbed a flashlight, pepper spray, and a taser. I don't even know what I was thinking, but I couldn't sit here, paralyzed by fear anymore. The only way to end this is to go back to where it all started. The air was thick with silence as I stepped outside, the flashlight casting weak beams through the trees. The moment I entered the forest, each step felt heavier than the last, as if the woods themselves were pulling me deeper into the darkness. I didn't know where I was going, but my legs seemed to remember the way. Soon enough, I found myself back at the place where we had first seen the clown crying. Suddenly, the rustling of leaves shattered the silence. I froze. The sound of snapping twigs grew closer. I slowly turned around. The flashlight shook in my trembling hands, illuminating a figure perched on a branch, whistling. It was him. He looked just like before, his white clothes smeared with dirt and something darker dried blood. His black wig was still a tangled mess. He just sat there, staring, holding the machete. The clown tilted his head, his smile twisting even more as he jumped down effortlessly, walking slowly, deliberately toward me. He said, "Welcome back." I was so angry I almost cried, yelling that I knew what he had done to John. The clown's smile faded, replaced by a fake look of pity. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I didn't kill him. He chose it. I shook my head, backing away. His words. When I ran, I remembered seeing John hesitate, standing still. He didn't seem scared, more like mesmerized. And what he said before we ran into the woods, he looks sad, doesn't he? I snapped back to reality as the clown got closer, saying that when it was my turn, I'd understand. His words hit me like a punch. I stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen branch. The flashlight slipped from my hand, flickering as it rolled across the ground. Darkness enveloped me, and I reached to grab it, but the clown's footsteps were closer now. I looked up and saw him towering over me, raising the machete. I pulled the pepper spray from my pocket and sprayed it. He staggered for a moment. But then I heard a voice that sounded like John's. "Alex, you need to leave. I don't know how." I didn't look back at the clown. I just ran. His laughter echoed behind me. Suddenly, I was standing in my backyard, alone. The forest was quiet now, the house dark and still. I rushed inside and called the police, convinced he was still out there. When the police arrived this time, he was there. They found him crouched near the lake, clutching the machete. His clothes were soaked in blood and dirt. He didn't resist when they approached. Later, they interrogated him for hours. The clown believed he was chosen to lead people to the other side. The police dismissed it as the ramblings of a madman. But even then, I knew something darker was at play. The cruise ship in room 105. 2 years ago, after days of hard work, I treated myself to a vacation. I had booked my holiday on a cruise ship, and my room was in cabin 105. I was informed that my cabin had bunk beds, so I would have to share the cabin with someone else. It was a bit inconvenient, but I thought it wouldn't be a problem. When I arrived, his belongings were there, a suitcase and a few clothes scattered around, but I didn't see him anywhere. The first thing I noticed when I stepped into the cabin was a musty smell in the air. The room was cold, abnormally cold, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But I brushed it aside, thinking it was just the sea air coming in through the vents. That night, I fell asleep in the bottom bunk, exhausted from the day's activities. I expected my roommate to return at any moment, but as I drifted off, the cabin remained quiet. At some point after midnight, I was jolted awake by a gentle noise from above. The top bunk creaked as if someone was shifting, and I assumed my roommate had finally returned and gone to bed. But then, I heard the noise again, a metallic clink. My eyes flew open. It was too dark to see anything, but I could hear footsteps moving toward the cabin door. A moment later, suddenly the door creaked open slowly, and I heard footsteps running down the hallway. Confused, I sat up, rubbing my eyes. Had my roommate come in and left without saying a word? The door remained ajar, gently swaying as the ship rocked with the waves. I got out of bed, walked over, and closed the door, the cold draft from the hallway sending chills down my spine. I looked up at the top bunk, the curtain drawn. The figure I had heard was gone, but there was something unsettling about the way the curtain hung, almost as if someone or something was still there, hiding behind it. When I woke up the next morning, the ship was gently swaying on the waves, but the cabin was freezing. The window was wide open, and the musty smell was worse than ever. The curtain on the top bunk was still drawn, and my roommate was nowhere to be found. I hadn't heard a single sound or voice from him. I decided to talk to a staff member about the discomfort of the cabin. His name was Nicky. I began explaining the cold, the foul smell, and the strange occurrences from the night. He listened, but as soon as I mentioned cabin 105, his expression changed. He asked me with a pale face if I was in cabin 105. I answered, confused by his reaction, and asked what was wrong. He hesitated for a moment, glancing around as if afraid someone might be eavesdropping. Then, in a low voice, leaning in and whispering, "There's something wrong with that cabin. Every passenger who's ever stayed there has disappeared. They all fell overboard. No one knows why. We're not allowed to talk about it. They say it's cursed." Having said that, he quickly left, leaving me standing there, stunned in shock. That night, I returned to the cabin, trying to suppress my fear. The curtain on the top bunk was still drawn tight, and the air was colder than ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I hadn't seen my roommate since I arrived. I decided to pull the curtain back to see for myself. My hands trembled as I reached for the curtain. I slowly pulled it back, hoping to find nothing. And indeed, there was nothing there, just an empty bed. The smell of the sea was now stronger, pungent and overwhelming. I could almost taste the salt on my tongue. Suddenly, the cabin door creaked open, and a cold gust of wind swept in. The room plunged into darkness as the flickering lights finally went out. My heart raced in my chest, and I heard it again. The sound. It was the sound of gentle footsteps again, but this time, they didn't come from the hallway. They came from the top bunk. I turned around just as I heard the creak that seemed to echo throughout the room. My blood ran cold. I could barely make out the shape of something moving beneath the blanket on the top bunk, writhing like a mass, and I could see the blanket suddenly swell oddly as if something was growing underneath it. I stepped back in fear as a pale, dripping hand slid out from beneath the blanket. It wasn't a human hand. It was swollen, grayish, the fingers puffy and twisted. The smell of rotting seaweed filled the air. I screamed, bolting out of the cabin, not stopping until I reached the deck. The cold night air hit me, and I leaned against the railing, trying to catch my breath. But when I looked up, the sight before me left me breathless. There, on the deck, was the shadow of a man. His body was pale and bloated, his clothes tattered and soaked. His hollow eyes stared at me, empty and soulless. I ran to one of the ship's staff, desperate to tell him what had happened. He listened, his expression serious, as he quietly said, "Cabin 105. I've heard the stories, but no one has ever seen what you have." He suggested that after his shift, he would come to the room with me to prove there was a reasonable explanation. I didn't want to go back, but I had no choice. The ship was full, and there was nowhere else for me to stay. He and I sat in the cabin, the door locked. We searched the room from top to bottom, but found nothing out of the ordinary. We had a glass of whiskey, trying to ease my tension. He began to tell me that the first time this happened was a month ago. The man in that cabin had issues. He had escaped from a mental hospital and booked a ticket for this cruise. They said he jumped overboard to end it all. But every passenger since then has seen something. Just then, as Nikki spoke, the window latch began to slowly turn, as if someone were on the other side. His face paled as the window opened on its own. The smell of the sea flooded the room, and the lights flickered once more. Something moved on the top bunk. Nikki stood up, eyes wide in fear at something on the bed. I turned around, my heart pounding. There, on the top bunk, was the figure of a pale, bloated man, soaked in seawater. His lifeless eyes stared down at us as he reached out his hand. Nikki rushed toward the door, but it was too late. The figure leaped off the bed, its cold, wet hands wrapping around his throat. He screamed, trying to break free, but it was too strong. It tightened, choking the life out of him. I grabbed the cross around my neck and held it up. It let out a scream of terror and released him, turning its deadly white eyes towards me. With one last desperate push, I flung the door open, and the figure rushed through, disappearing into the dark hallway. The figure seemed to dissolve into the night, its body sinking into the dark waters below. We stood on the deck, gasping for breath, the horror of what just happened sinking in. By morning, after witnessing everything, they had sealed off cabin 105. No one was allowed inside anymore. The ship continued its journey, but the horror lingered. Cabin 105 was cursed, and whatever haunted it would never truly disappear. The Blonde Girl. This is a story that happened a long time ago when I visited my local library. I have always been drawn to the lonely silence of old libraries. The air inside was heavy with the smell of old paper and dust, and the walls were lined with towering bookshelves that. I remember that I went there to borrow a few educational books. The internet existed at that time, but you couldn't just Google anything you wanted to know. The more conventional method for me was to go to the library and check out books on the subjects I was interested in. Anyway, I drove to the library, which was only about a 5-minute drive from my house. I walked in just as the library was about to close. I thought I was the only one in the library. As I walked through the aisles, my footsteps echoed softly on the wooden floor. The daylight outside was fading, casting long, strange shadows through the narrow windows. The library was quite large, and I headed to the section of books I was looking for. I felt immersed there. The silence was pleasant, only occasionally broken by the rustle of turning pages. I started looking for the best books to borrow. I spent a few minutes browsing and comparing the books. As evening approached, I decided to look at a particularly intriguing book I had found on spirituality, the supernatural, and horror. It was the only one on the shelf, and I picked it up. Some passages of the book talked about a blonde girl who had been brutally murdered, horrifically, by ancient cursed legends. She was like a sacrificial offering. Just as I was about to leave, a chill ran down my spine. I glanced over my shoulder and saw her, a blonde girl standing in the far corner of the library. She was partially obscured by the shadows, the light fading dimly. There was something unsettling about her presence, an eerie silence that seemed to absorb all sound around her. She seemed almost out of place. This woman appeared quite young, with blonde hair, wearing a polka dot headband as if from many decades ago. My heart began to race. The girl didn't move, her gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I hesitated, unsure whether to call out to her or quietly leave. As I watched, the girl took a few small, slow steps forward, revealing a pale, emotionless face. Her eyes were dark voids, empty and soulless. I felt a wave of terror wash over me, paralyzing me with fear. The girl took one step closer, then another, moving silently across the floor. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. She moved closer, her movements deliberate and haunting. When she was just a few meters away, she stopped and tilted her head to one side, as if studying me. Finally, I found the strength to move. I slowly backed away, my eyes never leaving hers. The girl remained still, staring at me with her empty, terrifying gaze. I turned and hurried towards the exit, clutching the book tightly. The oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of my footsteps echoing through the library. Then, suddenly, whispers grew louder, as if speaking directly into my ear, a mixture of voices seeming to come from everywhere. I looked around frantically but saw no one, and I couldn't determine their source. The library, once a sanctuary of knowledge, now felt like an abandoned house. As I fled, The whispers followed, growing more insistent. Panicking, I turned back, but the door had vanished, replaced by an endless corridor of bookshelves. The whispers were now deafening. I clutched the ancient book to my chest. I could see her clearly. The girl stood just inside the threshold, her black eyes sewn shut. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, as if cursing. Her face was grotesquely distorted, and she was holding a box containing something that looked like two eyes. I reached for the door and flung it open, the cold night air hitting me like a physical blow. As I made my way to the exit, I glanced back one last time. In the corner where the girl had stood, I saw a lock of blonde hair lying on the floor, glinting in the sunlight. The whispers had vanished, but the haunting feeling remained, a reminder that some secrets are better left undiscovered. I never spoke of what I saw that night. Sometimes, as I lay in bed, I was reminded not to mention the girl. She would scream, tears that couldn't fall because she had no eyes. If I spoke, she would be in danger for being exposed. Perhaps we had made a spiritual connection. She looked so pitiful. I didn't know what else to do but go to the church and pray for her. 2 months later, the dreams began to fade, and I rarely saw her in my sleep anymore. Perhaps it was a good thing for her. The Weirdo at the Pizza Shop. I am a manager at a pizza shop. It was a typical Tuesday night at the place where I work. We were getting ready to wrap up for the night, and the last customers were finishing their meals. But then, the doorbell chimed, and Brad walked in, a customer everyone feared. He was a huge man, weighing hundreds of kilograms. As he entered, a foul stench began to fill the air in the shop. He shuffled over to a table in the corner and ordered a few of our largest deep dish pizzas. Tonight was no different, except for the small cooler he brought with him. He placed it on the table with a thud that echoed through the shop. I asked him, "What's in the cooler, Brad?" He grinned at me, revealing yellow teeth, and said it was just some sides he brought along. We don't really allow outside food to avoid any trouble, so I just told him not to make a mess. He took out his food and started eating. Even from where I was, it looked disturbing the way he ate. Even from that distance, I could hear the slurping, the chomping, the way he devoured the food like a man possessed. When I finally mustered the courage to bring out his first pizza, the stench hit me. It was emanating from his cooler, like something rotten. Inside the plastic bags were chunks of meat. I told him he couldn't eat, that it must have gone bad. Then he suddenly took out a grayish lump and started gnawing on it. With relish, it looked like raw meat. As the hours passed, things got more unsettling. He kept ordering pizza after pizza, his appetite seemingly insatiable. The few remaining customers fled in horror at the sight of Brad. For a brief moment, I thought he was finally done, but he wasn't. He motioned for me to come over, his face glistening with grease and sauce, making my skin crawl. He held up the bag of meat and asked for it to be warmed up. I stepped back, feeling uneasy, but agreed and put it on a tray. I hurried it over to the microwave. The stench filled the kitchen as the microwave started. When it beeped, I hesitated to open it, terrified of what I might find inside. As the steam cleared, I saw an unmistakable shape among the chunks of meat. It was a human ear, shriveled and grotesque. I panicked. I was about to call the police when I heard a scream from the dining area. I rushed out and found Nana, my assistant, clutching her arm, blood streaming down it. She was trembling with pain and fear, saying that Brad had bitten her. I looked over to where Brad had been sitting, and for some reason, he was lying on the floor amid a mess of leftover food. Brad was gasping for air. His shirt had torn open, and his belly was distended in a grotesque way. The buttons on his shirt were slowly popping open. He still tried to crawl toward another slice of pizza, but something was wrong. His belly was swelling, looking like it was about to burst. He collapsed, face first into the pizza, his body convulsing once before going still. His last words were, "So hungry," which sent everyone in the room screaming in terror. I called the police and asked them to handle the situation with Brad. His death was officially ruled as natural causes due to overeating, but I knew the truth. What he had been eating was likely far more horrifying. A lot happened all at once. My shop had to close for several days, and every time I think about it, I feel a chill of horror. Stalkers in the dark. I started working as a security guard, night shifting at a small shopping mall in the city right after graduating high school. This job was supposed to be simple. Sit in front of the screen, watch people come and go, and occasionally handle shoplifters or suspicious behavior. But the truth is, the nights can be long, even boring. Until Black Friday arrived in the month leading up to Halloween. I had heard stories about the chaos, people acting as if they were clawing to get the best deals. It was madness, pushing and shoving like a zombie apocalypse. This year, I was scheduled for the dreaded Black Friday shift. It was my second year, and I thought I knew what to expect. What I didn't expect was the note. When I arrived for my shift that evening, I found a note waiting for me on my desk, right in front of the row of CCTV monitors. It simply read, "If you're in the dark, stay indoors." It was puzzling, and I had no idea who it was meant for or what it referred to. I felt a bit uneasy but brushed it off. Maybe it was a prank or something the cleaning crew accidentally left behind. I didn't want to dwell on it and focused on my job. As soon as the mall opened, chaos ensued. People pushed and shoved, scrambling for discounted items. Every walkie-talkie on the team was buzzing non-stop. We had 10 security guards on duty, and it still wasn't enough to manage the madness. Late in the evening, things calmed down a bit until I received a call over the radio. A group of men was reportedly mugging someone with a knife in the third-floor parking lot. I quickly decided to check the cameras to see what I was getting into. As I unlocked the door and swung it open, I nearly bumped into someone. There was a strange man sitting inside. He was standing in front of the screen, wearing a red and green Christmas outfit. His head turned toward the monitor, making me freeze. He slowly turned his face toward me, a pair of sunglasses covering his eyes, even though the room was pitch black. Before I could say a word, he stepped closer, his face just inches from mine, flashing a toothy grin, sharp teeth like a shark's. "Did you get my note?" I reached for the walkie-talkie, but before I could do anything, the lights in the room went out, plunging us into complete darkness. I raised my hands, bracing for him to lunge at me, but instead, I felt nothing. I shone the flashlight, and he had vanished, leaving the room empty with just me standing there. I tried to calm myself and refocus on my pressing duties. The dimly lit corridors of the mall were filled with strange decorations, shadows, and the faint echo of creepy sound effects coming from the nearby costume shop. As I walked around, I noticed something strange. A life-sized mannequin in the costume shop window. It was dressed in an outfit identical to that of the strange man. I turned to look behind me as I heard a noise coming from behind, glancing through the shop's glass. The mannequin was no longer inside. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and I heard a raspy laugh behind me. I turned around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and there he was, the man, grinning horrifically and then lunging toward me. I stumbled back, narrowly dodging him. I weaved between the aisles and ran up the escalator. my heart pounding as I tried to put as much distance as possible between us. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the security room and slammed the door shut, locking it tight behind me. I quickly accessed the camera feeds, searching for any sign of the man. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the screens, but I couldn't find him anywhere. Then, on one of the feeds, I saw him standing in the hallway just outside the security room, staring directly into the camera. A sinister smile plastered across his face, waving at me. I grabbed the walkie again, calling for backup, but the signal was distorted. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. I hurriedly fumbled for my flashlight. A creaking sound like claws scraping the door echoed. I braced myself, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, as the door swung open and he stepped inside, laughing mockingly at my fear. I remembered the emergency lever behind the desk. Without hesitation, I rushed over, pulling it down just as he reached for me. He lunged at me. We got caught in a struggle. He was stronger than he looked, his hands clawing at me as I tried to push him away. We slammed into the metal shelves, the impact echoing throughout the room. I pulled the walkie from my belt, calling for backup again. My voice trembled with tension, but I just hoped someone would hear me. After a tense struggle, I pushed him away one last time, and he staggered. This time, I seized the opportunity, quickly grabbing a metal rod nearby and locking it against the door, trapping him inside. I quickly called for assistance. I stood guard at the door, listening to his screams from the other side. Within minutes, 2 officers ran down the hallway, guns drawn. They reached me, and I unlocked the door, stepping back as they stormed in. I watched as they put him into the police car, his eyes still fixed on me until the very last moment. Back in the security room, I sat down, exhausted but relieved. I scrolled through the camera feeds, carefully checking each one. Then on the feed from the costume shop, I noticed something odd. A new mannequin, dressed in the same outfit, stood in the display window. My heart raced as I leaned closer to the screen. It was just a mannequin, right? As I looked, a shadow moved behind it, just a flicker, barely visible. My hand hovered over the controls, but I shook my head to clear my thoughts. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks after a long night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting for me out there to confront it. Haunting on the midnight train, the town lay deep in the mountains, with old houses scattered about and streets filled with whispers of long-forgotten stories. One of those mysterious tales was about the midnight train. For many years, no one dared to board the train, but I was not like them. I was the kind of person who believed that fear was for those not seeking answers. On that cold winter night, I decided it was time to confront the truth myself. I arrived at the train station just before midnight. The platform was empty, the old wooden benches creaking under the weight of the cold wind. Flickering lights cast strange shadows. The ticket counter was manned by an elderly station master, his eyes glancing at me with a mix of concern and pity.
"Are you sure about this, son?"
I nodded, smiling confidently at him. "It's just a train ride. I'll be back." The station master sighed and handed me the ticket. I caught a glimpse of him muttering a small prayer as I walked toward the platform. The slow minutes dragged on as I waited. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the town was holding its breath. Then, in the distance, I heard the whistle of a train, its headlights slicing through the darkness like 2 eerie eyes. The train stopped before me, its peeling black paint and dirty, soulless windows. The door creaked open, inviting me inside. I hesitated for a moment, but then took a deep breath and stepped inside. The flickering lights cast long shadows across the old seats. The air was thick with dust and something else, something I couldn't quite identify. A feeling, unnatural, As I walked down the aisle, I realized the train was empty. No passengers, no ticket collector, no signs of life. Strangely, I wasn't scared. Instead, I felt a thrill. I sat by the window, watching the small town fade away into the distance. At first, everything seemed fine. The train accelerated, speeding through the night, but after what felt like hours, I noticed something was off. The darkness outside the window was unusual, like a void. I glanced at the clock, only to see the hands frozen in place. A sense of unease washed over me. The light above me flickered violently before plunging the train into complete darkness. I held my breath. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to use it as a flashlight. But when I pressed the screen, it remained black, completely unresponsive. Panic set in. Suddenly, I heard it, a whisper.
Jacob.
My heart skipped a beat. I froze, trying to listen. The voice was faint, barely above a breath, but it was there.
Jacob, come to me.
I turned around, but the car was empty. The whispers grew louder, closer. I hurriedly stood up and stumbled, trying to find the ticket collector's car. When I reached the front, I found the car empty. Just an old, dusty uniform hanging on a hook. No one was there. The train shook violently, throwing me off balance. I clung to the seat to steady myself as the whole car seemed to tremble. The train was moving faster, dangerously fast. I reached for the control panel, hoping to stop the train, but it was covered in dust and cobwebs, as if it hadn't been used in years. My fingers fumbled over the switches, but nothing worked. Then the whispers returned, growing louder, filling the air around me.
You can't escape, Jacob.
My blood ran cold. Those words seeped into my ears, chilling me to the bone. I turned to leave, but something held my feet in place. I looked down and saw an old pair of shoes still attached to a ghostly figure. It was pale, translucent, its face twisted in pain. Its hollow eyes stared at me. Then, more appeared. Ghostly figures emerged from the darkness, their bodies flickering like dying candles. They reached out to me, their cold, damp hands, their voices filled with sorrow.
Help us.
Save us.
I tried to back away, but the shadowy figures closed in on me. Their icy hands brushed against my skin, sending shivers down my spine. Desperate, I pushed them away, their cries echoing in my ears. I needed to escape now. At the back of the train, I found a locked door leading outside. I pounded on it, shouting, but it wouldn't budge. Then, in the corner of the car, I noticed a faint light. I knelt down and lifted a loose floorboard, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was an old, dust-covered journal. The journal belonged to the original train conductor. He described strange occurrences and ghosts. His final entry spoke of a curse, a train cursed to hold the souls of the dead on board, and there was only one way to break it, by confronting the source of the haunting and seeking out the mirror in the car to destroy it. Determined, I followed through to the back of the train. At the rear, I found a large, cracked mirror. Its surface shimmered with a strange energy. Looking into it, I saw the faces of trapped souls reflected in the glass, their eyes filled with sorrow. Its shape shifted and swirled. Terror engulfed me, but I couldn't let it win. I searched for something to break it, as if someone were hiding everything to stop me from doing this. I decided not to wait, reaching out with trembling hands, and punched the cold glass. The figure screamed a piercing scream as the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. The ghastly shadows around me began to fade, their faces peaceful as they were finally freed. The train also started to slow down. I staggered onto the platform, my heart still racing, my body aching from the ordeal. The town, now bathed in the gentle light of dawn, returned to its quiet state. As I looked back at the train, it was now just an old locomotive, The station master was waiting for me on the platform, a pleasant smile of relief understanding what I had accomplished as he left. I nodded, too exhausted to speak, but grateful to be alive. I had freed the trapped souls on the midnight train, and I knew I would never forget the terror I had faced. The midnight train had become legend, but the memory of that night would stay with me forever.
Two children without eyes. The setting sun cast long shadows over the quiet suburban neighborhood. Ivy, a young woman in her 20s, was walking home after work. The streets were unusually empty, and the air carried a strange chill. As she turned the corner, she noticed two figures standing under a flickering streetlight. They were children, a boy and a girl, around 8 or 9 years old. They stood unnaturally still. Ivy wheezed. Steps slowed as she approached them, a growing sense of unease with each step. But it was the only way for her to get home. The children simultaneously turned their heads, and Ivy's breath caught in her throat. Their faces were pale and expressionless. But what struck her most were their eyes, or rather, the absence of them. These children had smooth, empty voids where their eyes should have been. The eye sockets were dark and hollow, an abyss that seemed to pull at her very soul. Ivy's heart pounded as she stopped a few steps away from them. The boy and girl began to move, their movements unnaturally stiff. They stepped towards her, their empty sockets somehow feeling like they were staring menacingly. Ivy wanted to run, but her legs felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The children reached out, their hands pale and cold. They lightly touched her, sending a chill through her body. As their fingers met her skin, images flooded Ivy's mind. She saw dark hallways, old, decaying houses, and a profound sense of sadness and fear. The disjointed images, like mismatched puzzle pieces, kept flashing through her mind. Suddenly, the children let go, and the images stopped. Ivy stumbled back, gasping for air. The boy and girl stood there, silent and still. The flickering streetlight cast eerie shadows on their faces, making their hollow sockets appear even darker. Ivy ran, her heart pounding. She didn't stop until she reached her home. Slamming the door shut, she leaned against it, trying to calm her frantic breathing. The encounter had left her shaken, and the images from those children still lingered in her mind. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the eyeless children and the haunting images they had shown her. She knew she had to find out who they were and what had happened to them. The next day, Ivy returned to the spot where she had seen the children, but they were gone. She began asking around the neighborhood, describing the children to anyone who would listen. Most people shook their heads, saying they had never seen or heard of such children. But an old man at the local library seemed to know something. His eyes widened in recognition when she described them. He told her about a tragic accident that had happened many years ago. 2 children had died in a fire at an old house that once stood on the very street where Ivy now lived. Their bodies had been found, but their eyes had mysteriously gone missing. The house had been abandoned and eventually demolished, but it was said that the children's spirits still haunted the area. Ivy felt a chill run down her spine as the old man spoke. She realized that the images she saw were the children's memories, their plea for help. Determined to soothe their spirits, she decided to search for the remnants of the old house. It took many days of searching, but she finally found it. It was a patch of overgrown grass, hidden behind a row of new houses. As she stood there, she felt a presence around her. The air grew colder, and she knew the children were near. Ivy knelt down and began to dig. She uncovered charred pieces of wood, the remains of the old house, and then she found a small, scorched box. Inside were 2 porcelain dolls, their eyes missing, Ivy's. Heart ached as she realized these were the children's cherished toys. With trembling hands, she placed the dolls back in the box and whispered a prayer for the children's souls. The air around her seemed to lighten, and she felt a gentle breeze brush her face, as if in thanks. Relieved, she knew she had done the right thing. The eyeless children were no longer bound to their tragic past, and perhaps she had helped them find their way to the afterlife.
Scary night at the toy store. The night sky was heavy, and the large parking lot outside a quiet toy store was dimly lit by a few sparse streetlights. The store was about to close, and Sana, a woman in her 30s, walked toward the entrance. She held a list tightly in her hand. Her daughter's 6th birthday was coming up soon. Inside, the store was nearly empty. Sana walked past shelves filled with toys. She felt excited as she picked up stuffed animals and birthday decorations. As she walked, she had the unsettling feeling that someone was watching her. She glanced over and saw a man at the end of the aisle. He wore a long black coat and had a hat pulled low over his face. He just stood there, staring at her. Sana immediately looked away, pretending not to notice, but she could feel his eyes burning into her. She grabbed the last item on her list and moved to a different aisle, hoping to shake the strange and uneasy feeling. For the next 15 minutes, she tried to continue shopping, moving through different parts of the store. She hurried through checkout, her nerves on edge. After paying, she headed for the exit. The parking lot was almost empty, except for her car and a suspicious gray SUV parked nearby. The vast emptiness made the SUV's proximity unsettling. As she neared her car, Sana's heart raced when she heard a car door open from the other side of the SUV. The man in the black coat emerged from around the SUV. It was the same man from the store. Her fear began to rise as she recognized him. She thought she needed to hide for a while. Sana hurried inside, her breath quickening. The store was nearly empty now, and the isolation was overwhelming. She moved through the aisles, trying to lose the man in the maze of shelves. Every few minutes, she glanced over her shoulder. The man was there, trailing her through the store. He kept his distance but never let her out of his sight. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. She quickly dialed her husband, and when he answered, she whispered urgently into the phone. He promised he would be there in less than 10 minutes. The minutes felt like hours as she moved around the store, pretending to browse but always keeping an eye on the man. At one point, he seemed to lose interest and walked toward the exit, but as Sana neared the checkout counter, he lined up right behind her. The air felt stifling. She quickly moved through rows of stuffed animals and dolls, praying that the man wouldn't see her anymore. She crouched behind a shelf, pressing her back against it. She looked around, but didn't see him anywhere. For a moment, she dared to hope that he had really left. But then, the soft sound of footsteps on the floor shattered her illusion of safety. He rounded the corner, his figure looming larger as he got closer. Sana's back pressed against the shelf, and a row of dolls wobbled. She flinched in fear as one of them fell to the ground with a soft thud. The man stopped just a few feet away. She glanced, her eyes alert, watching his every move. This close, she could make out more details. His gloved hands, the lower part of his face visible beneath the brim of his hat. A faint, crooked smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He took another step toward her. He reached into his coat, and for a moment, Sana's heart stopped. Was he pulling out a weapon? What was he about to do? Suddenly, headlights swept across the parking lot as a car pulled in. Sana's husband had arrived, and his car stopped right in front of the toy store. The man glanced toward the lights, his expression stiffening, growing cautious. He stepped back into the shadows as Sana's husband drew closer. Sana saw her husband get out of the car. He walked toward the store, his eyes scanning the parking lot for her. She seized the moment and ran past the man, her heart pounding as she sprinted toward the store entrance. She didn't look back, but she could feel his eyes burning into her as she escaped. Sana rushed through the front door of the store, running toward her husband. Her face was pale, and her hands were trembling, but she was safe. She collapsed into his arms, her breath coming in gasps as the fear that had overwhelmed her began to fade. Her husband looked past her, scanning the store for the man, but the parking lot had returned to its eerie calm. The man in the black coat had disappeared, melting into the shadows. Her husband gripped the steering wheel, ready to drive them home, but Sana couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Later that night, Sana's phone rang. It was a call from the local police station. The man had been caught. They wanted her to come in and give a statement. The man had been arrested just hours after leaving the parking lot. A patrol car had spotted his SUV parked suspiciously in another lot near a shopping mall. When the police approached him casually, he resisted arrest, acting erratically. Sana listened intently as the detective began revealing disturbing details that had come to light after his arrest. During questioning, the man, identified as Dennis, initially refused to cooperate. He claimed he was just shopping late and looking for lost car keys, but his story quickly unraveled. The police found disturbing evidence inside his SUV, items that made Sana's skin crawl. First, there was a knife, wrapped in cloth and hidden under the passenger seat. It wasn't an ordinary knife. The blade was worn, and the handle was smooth from years of use. Next to it was a set of duct tape, rope, and zip ties, all stashed in a small canvas bag. Dennis had likely planned something far worse than just following her. The real horror came when they found the photos. Many were of women, all taken from a distance, some in grocery stores, others as they left malls, a few while walking their dogs. And then Sana's breath caught in her throat. Scattered among the pictures were photos of her, some from the toy store that night, and many others taken before. They were taken when she dropped her daughter off at school, when she went grocery shopping, and even when she left her apartment. Realizing Dennis had been following her for days, maybe weeks, made her feel sick. As the investigation continued, more terrifying truths about Dennis emerged. He often stalked women, but none of his victims had ever filed charges. He was disturbingly careful, always skirting the edges of the law, always evading arrest or detection. 2 years earlier, in another town, Dennis had been investigated for the disappearance of a woman, though no evidence was ever found. The case had since gone cold. Sana was horrified to realize she could have easily become another cold case, another missing person, if her husband hadn't arrived in time that night. The police assured her Dennis would be locked up and no longer a threat. Sana and her husband left the police station. They drove home in the quiet darkness. She glanced over at her husband, grateful that he had arrived just in time. But deep down, a new sense of caution had been born. She would never let her guard down like that again.